Hello and welcome to using DPM 2012 to protect SharePoint 2010. My name is Chris Butcher. I'm a Senior Support Escalations Engineer with Microsoft for the Data Protection Manager team, and I will be presenting this session for you today. First, a quick review of what we're going to be covering in this. We will very quickly touch on DPM 2012 overview. This session was written at the release of DPM 2012, so it talks specifically about that. Because DPM 2012 SP1 has released, I will also throw in some mentions of functionality and other things that were brought in with that. We will look quickly at setting up protection for a SharePoint farm. We'll talk a little bit in depth about service applications. I don't have any of those set up to demo, but they're all going to be very individualized, and we'll get into that and how that would look for you. We'll talk about using aliases in your SharePoint farm. We'll talk about remote blob storage. We'll look at the cataloging process that SharePoint and DPM use together, and then we'll also talk about the restore process. First, the DPM 2012 overview, and this is just some of the things that were new with DPM 2012. Or that were enhanced. And in the enhancement category, with SharePoint ILR, the item level restore for SharePoint farms was made to be much simpler, more streamlined, and a much faster process than it has been in the past, and we'll get into the specifics of that later on in this presentation. We've also changed the Hyper-V Express full methodology, and with DPM 2012 it was only effective for a standalone Hyper-V server, and with 2012 SP1 we can now do the same change tracking, which decreases the data transfer for Hyper-V protection for a Windows 2012 CSV volume or CSV Hyper-V setup that we're protecting. So been a lot of advances in that, and the increased efficiency is quite astonishing. We also introduced RBS support officially with DPM 2012, and we allow that now in a SharePoint farm that's using RBS. We've made some changes in how you can configure, manually configure and tweak the tape management and media in DPM 2012. Some of the new additions is that we have allowed for certificate protection for untrusted domains, or for work groups we can use a certificate instead of a local user account, which takes away some of that management process. We've extended our data source protection, and at this point we've added VMM protection. And as we move forward, we'll be continuing to hopefully add more Microsoft products as they release and we test them, and we can get those added to the product. And finally, one of the biggest things people were asking for was centralized management, and we have a couple different areas that talk about that. One is the remote administration, where you can run simply launch a DPM console against a remote DPM server without having to do the RDP session. Or we have the central console, which integrates with the Ops Manager 2012 or 2012 SP1, and it allows you to use an Ops Manager console to manage all of your DPM servers in a single pane of glass. And there's another additional recording that covers the advantages and how to set that up and how to get that running. So specifically talking about SharePoint and how to set up protection. It's a somewhat of an easy process as long as you understand kind of what's going on behind the scenes and what we need to see. For the setup, one of the bigger things is we need agents on every server in the farm. So for a relatively standard farm, you're going to have anywhere from 1 to many web front-end servers. And then you're going to have a set of back-end SQL servers, whether that's going to be a clustered setup, mirrored, or just a standalone SQL server. It doesn't really matter. The one thing that I can address at this point is that if your back-end is using SQL 2012 with Always On. Combined with SharePoint, we won't be able to protect that. At this point, that's something that's in the works and we're looking into it, but at this point, we can't protect a SharePoint form that's using a SQL 2012 availability group or Always On in the back end. But once you've identified your SQL servers as well as your web front-end servers, you want to push an agent from your DPM server onto all of those. And that's relatively well known, and it's not a whole lot of mystery about getting an agent onto your servers. Once that's done, we want to pick a single web front-end server that we're going to deal with, and that will be our point of focus. Again, we only want one of the web front-end servers to run this on, and once we've identified that, it doesn't matter which one, you'll run configure SharePoint.exe with the enable SharePoint protection switch. What that's going to do is set up the permissions, enable the DCOM application, the WSS commandlets wrapper.exe, and get everything ready, and finally enable the SharePoint services writer. You can use DCOM config to go back and double check what user has been configured when you ran this command. Also, you can use that to, if the password changes for that user, it does need to be a farm administrator, but if that password changes, you can use the DCOM config to update that. There are some special considerations. First off, if you have customizations, anything that comes out of the box with our protection is going to be that we will protect your SharePoint config, admin content, and then any additional content databases. So if you go through a DPM and just check the box that it says SharePoint, what we're going to be protecting there are the SharePoint content databases, the basics of the farm. So if you have any additional customizations, if you're using any additional templates, if you have service applications, all of these things are outside of the basics of what DPM will protect natively. So you need to be aware of what is involved with that, and just be aware of what other files, what other folders, if it's in the registry, if it's an additional database, what exactly is involved. Again, I will get into some specific ideas on some service applications, what you can and can't do, and some ideas on how to protect those. But the bottom line for any customization, any templates, any service applications is you have to be aware of what they are, and then you have to test backing up with a method, and then test a restore to make sure you are getting all of the information you need. Some of the out of the or inbox special service applications would be like the search that comes with SharePoint, and we again don't natively protect that. User profile service, and user profile service is a good example of one where if we were to just back up the database for the user profile service, it would not properly restore because it has some special identity keys that it needs backed up when you back up the database. So the two have to be joined together in order to get a good backup. So just backing up the user profile service database is not going to be helpful or useful at all. So talking about service applications, there's really two approaches I think that are worth looking at. And one of them is using the SharePoint inbox PowerShell script or command that you can force it to back up a service application. The other one is to back up the database and then determine what other files or what other components are required to have that backed up. So for instance, if you are creating your own service application, or you have purchased a third-party service app which is just a database, or maybe just a database and files, then there's a couple of ways to look at what that how you could set that up. Now this one is specific to doing it through SQL. So we could back up the database, and it's easy to do. you set up your protection for SharePoint, and then you come back in and you select the databases, because again, SharePoint protection will only get the content databases. So when you come back in, you'll notice that all of your service application databases are not protected. So you can come in through a SQL protection and check the boxes to protect those. It's very easy to set up in DPM. The backups are small. We're just getting differentials. It's a very solid backup of a SQL database. The cons to this is that it may not capture all of the data. You may have a database, but it's also relying on a folder structure that service application installed. Or it could be that the service application has some registry keys that it requires. So if there are other pieces that this service application is going to require, it comes down to a point of you have to know what are those pieces, and can I back them up separately and just restore the folder structure and the database from the same time? Will that service application survive and come back up and be a strong and possible or viable option? Now, whether or not your service application is going to be backed up as a service application or content database, it's quite simple. You can go through and do protection via SharePoint data source, or you can use Disk Shadow. And when you run Disk Shadow and then list writers, it will list out your SharePoint metadata, and for each database listed, it will give a caption. If the caption for that database is content, then that means it's going to be backed up by the SharePoint workload. If it is generic, that means it will not. It's a very quick and easy way to look at that. And we also have a link here to a TechNet site that talks about some of these backup options and the ways we can get to that. The alternate method that we can use here would be then to use the PowerShell. Now, the PowerShell command in question here can be found at that link. And basically what it is it's a SharePoint PowerShell, which you can specify a very specific service application to back up, and it will compile all of the information required to back that up, and then back that up to a flat file. So the pros involved with this is it captures all the data for the entire service application. It's a SharePoint aware backup of your specified service application. The cons is that it's going to create this data file for each backup, and since the backup or that data file is going to be huge, when you go to do your backups, if you're going to use DPM to then back up these data files, everyone is going to be different. So every time you back that up and then back it up with DPM, we're not going to be looking at change blocks because we're going to see a different separate file. So if you're backing that up daily, that can grow and could get to be very large depending on obviously the size of the service application. The other thing is there would be extra steps involved with this, and that you would have to schedule PowerPoint to come in and create this backup on whatever schedule. Now it's not that difficult, it just does require extra steps. So a quick look at some of the things I talked about. One was I mentioned that Disk Shadow can be used to determine if a specified data source database is going to be a content or a service application database. So what you would do is run disk shadows, and in this case if you use the /l and then writers.txt, what it's going to do is pipe out everything you do in the disk shadow prompt to that writers.txt file. So in this case I did that, and then I've opened it up, and this is edited way down just to see the pertinent content. But if you look under the writer for the SharePoint Services writer, you'll see on the top here we have a database that is a content database. It's WSS_content_B. And in this case, if you look at the caption, it does list it as a content database. Down below, you've got a database called project server_published. That is a service application for project server, And if you look at the caption for it, it does in fact show that it is a generic database. Therefore, selecting your SharePoint farm through the DPM protection methodology, it will not pick up any database that has generic. It will only capture databases with the caption of content. Now, the other way to look at this is after you've protected and selected your SharePoint farm, up here you see SharePoint 01, that you've got the SharePoint icon here, and that's already been done and protected. Now I'm going back in, and this is my SQL server where I had my SharePoint information, and you'll see that I've got this these service databases that are in here, and those were not picked up. That's why they have checkboxes, because they were not picked up. Anything that doesn't have a checkbox, those were the content databases that by default were picked up when I selected this box. So I could come through here, check this, and it will pick up all the remaining databases in this instance. By default, auto is on, so that means any new databases that are added to this instance will be picked up. If it's a content database, it'll automatically be picked up by SharePoint. If it is a generic database, it'll automatically be picked up by this SQL protection. And then once you've done the protection, it looks something like this. Now what I've done here is I also went in and picked up the inetpub directory, because often you'll need stuff from inetpub. You will also often need something from the config or 12 or 14 directories. Again, that all depends on what service applications you have, what customized templates you have. You really have to know your farm and what additional stuff you have. If there's anything outside of the content databases specifically, then you need to be aware of what that is. You also see that down below, then I've got our SQL protection, which picks up just the service application databases and other stuff. The method I talked about for running the backup via PowerShell is shown here. This is the SharePoint management shell, and I used the backup SP farm, and then I told it what directory to, what backup method, and you would have to walk through this to determine all the switches, but I've got this one set up to back up a service application I had created called word conversion. And when I did that, you'll see that in that SP data folder, it creates a folder for each time we do a backup, and down below in the background you would see that this is the word conversion service application that I had created. So there's not that much to it. Again, this is the method that best picks up the actual data that we require, but again, those applications could get to be very large, and if you're doing this daily, then you're going to need a lot more space, because we're not going to be able to do differencing files from one file to the next. Each file will be its own. But if we were to do that in DPM, you would just back up your SharePoint farm as you see in a normal workflow here, and then add that SP data folder to get the additional service applications to get the additional data that we needed there. So now we'll do a basic farm protection demo. I don't have any service applications set up, so the last thing I'll say about that is to reiterate one more time that you have to be very aware of what your service application is, what files it has, what files it needs in order to back it up and restore it. If it's just a database, if it's a database plus specific folder structure, or a database plus some registry, you have to understand all of that and then be able to back that up. DPM can back it up, you just have to know what it needs in order to be backed up, and then DPM can do the rest for you. So for our basic farm protection, we'll look at my environment here. In my environment, I have a very simple setup of my SharePoint server, And you can see that it's using a backend foundation database. Server is cbutch 781. The web front end server is cbutch 81. So the first thing we need to do, as we talked about earlier, is we need to have an agent on each of the servers. We do have an agent on 81 and cbutch 81. So we're good there and ready to set up. The second piece that we need is on the web front end server, we need to run the command to allow the web front end server, the WSS commandlets wrapper DCOM application needs to be started and configured with the correct user, and we need to enable the SharePoint services writer. We can do all of that by running the SharePoint.exe enable SharePoint protection command from the DPM bin folder on the web front end server. And we've done that here, and for the username I'm just going to use my user, and this user it's requesting here has to be a farm administrator, and of course it does want it in the domain /username. We are in lab 293565 user. And again, this will go through, set up the DCOM permissions for the WSS commandlets wrapper, and then enable the writer. Everything is returned successfully there. Now we can go back to our DPM server and set up our protection group. Now we do have a little bit of confusion here because our backend databases are on a different server. A lot of times people will come in and try to do this protection because they'll see the content databases listed under the SQL writer. They'll try to protect them there, and that's the wrong one. What you really want is to make sure that we have the SharePoint icon as our point of protection, and not, you see we've got our content databases here, but that's not actually where we want the protection to be at. So we don't want to do it via SQL because we want our content databases to be protected here. Now the big difference here, the reason that we want our content databases protected through this workload is because if we protect them this way, DPM will understand that it's a content database. It will do the actual cataloging of that content database and allow you to be able to restore the individual items. If you do a SQL protection, all we can do is restore that entire database back to its original location. So you wouldn't be able to restore a document, a list, a site, anything specific in SharePoint. So that's the reason we want to do our protection this way. Now again, depending on what you know about your environment, you may want to go from that web front-end server and get system state, which will get your IIS settings. So if you're doing anything specialized or specific with IIS, with protection, with any permissions or anything like that, you'd want to do your IIS protection through system state. If you're doing anything special with templates, then you would come into your C drive and navigate down to where they are. Usually, again, those are probably going to be in your Office 12 or 14 directory. Again, you have to be aware of what you're using, where those files are, but that would help get that information. In my case, I'm not doing any of that, so we're just going to set up a very basic farm protection. and let everything use the defaults. Of course, we need to make a tweak and make sure we have disk space, but we are good here. And now we will finish, take all the defaults, and allow DPM to create the initial replica, create the 2 volumes, one for the replica volume, one for the recovery points, and then go out and determine which databases it's going to pull data from. And then once that's all done, you can go into monitoring and check on the progress. And there are the databases as it picks them up and attempts to get everything rolling there. So that's basic farm protection. You might notice through this that I do have databases on several different servers. There are some databases on the local web front-end server. It was initially set up with just all of its the content databases local to it, and then I added additional SQL backend for it to leverage, which it is now has some content databases there. So protection is up and running, and that's basic farm protection. Now a little bit more advanced, we can look at using aliases. Using aliases is something a lot of farms are doing, and this allows you to be a little more seamless in what your SharePoint farm sees, and you can point your SharePoint farm to a specific name on the farm itself, and then on the back end you can move that around. So you can decommission a back-end SQL server, move it over to another one, and all you have to do is change where the alias points and not have to mess with SharePoint to tell it, hey, we're using a different SQL server now, so make all the changes. That becomes a real headache versus using aliases where you can just point it from one server to another, and then the translation just happens on the back end as your SharePoint farm continues to use or look for the same location. So for configuring the settings, first off, it has to be a TCP/IP SQL alias. The aliases have to be configured on all web front-end servers, and that's more of a SharePoint thing than a DPM thing. The DPM does require the SQL client connectivity components on the web front-end server where we're configuring protection. And the reason behind that is the client connectivity components will actually intercept the calls and do the translation for us so that the writer understands who actually it needs to communicate with in order to get back up the databases. So if you're looking for, if SharePoint is looking for SQL Server 1, but in reality the databases are on SQL Cluster 1, that alias will intercept any call for SQL Server 1 and then put in instead SQL Cluster 1. Now, if you're using SharePoint 2007, you have to have the 2005 components, and on top of that you have to have the 32-bit if you're running SharePoint 2007 32-bit. If you're running SharePoint 2007 64-bit, then you need the 64-bit version of the client connectivity components. So you have to not only have the right version of 05 for SharePoint 2007, but you also have to have the right 32 or 64-bit version. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because it's feasible for SharePoint to work fine without this, and it's also possible that DPM will appear to work fine, but then it'll inevitably run into a problem if all of these aren't met up specifically. And if you're on SharePoint 2010, then we would use the SQL 2008 components. And there is one one quick test for this by creating a UDL file, and I say it's a quick test because really all that's doing is it's going to test to make sure real generic aliases are set up correctly. But in the end, I've seen many times where UDL files will work and all the other tests work, just telling us aliases are working. But for instance, if we don't have that, if you're running a 64-bit version of SharePoint 2007, but you have the 32-bit tools on there, the aliases will work, the UDL file will work fine, everything will connect as expected, but DPM won't be able to protect it. So a couple looks at this on how these aliases will work. This is the SQL Server Configuration Manager. These are the tools I was talking about. So once you have these installed, the Configuration Manager installed, you can look in and you'll see that you've got the SQL Native client, which is the 32-bit, and then down below you've got the SQL Native client configuration. That's actually the 64-bit. Now don't mistake, these are not the versions of the tools. These are actually a 32-bit alias and a 64-bit alias that this is representing. So there's a little bit different here from what I was talking about when I said the tool versions. So these are very different from the 32 and 64-bit versions of the tool. These are 32 and 64-bit aliases, and what I've seen and tested is that DPM requires the 32-bit alias, which I have highlighted here in the yellow, and usually, depending on your version of SharePoint, I've seen it where SharePoint doesn't work unless you have the 64-bit version. You can also check and take a quick look at that by using the built-in CLI config to see what aliases are configured, but the CLI config by default is just showing you the 64-bit if you're on a 64-bit OS. So what you see here will be reflected in this red section, but it won't show you what you have in the yellow. So it's only going to show you one version of the alias. So for a demo, what we'll do is we'll set up our environment with an actual alias. As you can see right now, our SharePoint server only knows about the local database that it has on the web front-end server, and then the databases it's got, content databases, which are located on CButch 781. So what I'll do is I will set up another content database, and I'll point it to a server called SQL 4. But in reality, what we're going to do is resolve SQL 4 and point that to a different SQL server on the back end. Okay, so in the background, I went ahead and created a new content database on a server named SQL 4. And you'll see here now that our SharePoint farm knows about 3 servers. The web front-end server, which is CButch 81, and also has some content databases there. We have a second SQL server, CButch 781, where we have some content databases. And now we have this third server called SQL 4. We'll notice if we ping server CButch 781, everything resolves, comes back fine. But if we try to ping SQL 4, it doesn't know anything about it because SQL 4 is not an actual box. So what we're doing here is, behind the scenes, we've used our SQL Server Configuration Manager, and we created an alias basically saying anything that comes through on the SQL side for a box named SQL 4, we're going to redirect it to CButch 782. We did the same thing again for the 64-bit version of the alias. So now we have SQL 4 according to SharePoint, but when that gets interpreted behind the scenes, DPM will see it as the actual server and will be able to connect to the box to get the backup. So we can come into DPM and we'll modify our protection group. And now back at our farm, after it's had a chance to communicate with the farm, we'll see that we do actually have in monitoring a warning that's popped up that says one or more databases have been added. So this is just giving us an indicator that it's seen it. If you let this go during the next run, it will pick that up. You can also go in during the middle of the day and again do the modify protection group. We're not changing anything here. We're just walking through it. This is going to force it to go in again and look at it and make sure it has everything that's part of the group to allow it to pick everything up. And this should allow it to go in and pick up the new database. And take a second here for the consistency check to run. But anyway, that's it for getting the aliases to configured properly and get them running to where we can back them up. We'll go ahead and cut this recording off here so that it's we'll make it in 2 small sections. So part 2, we will finish out the deck and wrap it up. Thank you very much.